You're watching the news now. Now, 3,000 faces and counting.
Welcome back to the news now. Now, look around you outside and you will notice that this world is an angry place. Not there, over there. Utter bastard. Nowadays, it's incredibly easy to look either online or in the streets and see nothing but anger, hatred, and misery. But is that a true reflection of what we are? Has it always been who we are? Or are we trapped in a self-perpetuating... Hey! Don't click off. There, all right? Everything's gonna be fine. So join us today as we travel through the annals of history to answer one of history's hardest questions. Has the human race always been a giant bastard? Well, to start answering this question, first we go live to our reporter at the Newswall, Stag. Thank you, Stag. The history of this planet is brutal. Absolutely everything that was on the ground or in the skies had one thing on its mind. Survival. Survival for their species, survival for their family. But we're not here to talk about any of these terrifying, scaly creatures, and it's a good job too, because all of them died in a violent explosion, and life went back to living underwater. That was until one Romanian man popped up out of the sea, or at least that's what I'm told according to the internet, which of course is the only source of information that we have nowadays. This is Vlad III of Romania, Wallachia to be specific. Born on a cold November night in 1431, he would grow up to become someone. Vlad had a dad called Vlad and also a brother called Chad who were murdered by a sultan called Murad, and that's bad. Vlad III was allowed to live on the sole condition that his brother and his dad stay behind to die, which apparently they were completely fine with, even though the brother, whose name was actually this, was blinded and then buried alive. Vlad's dad also got a romp in the swamp and a bonk in the back of the head to sleep eternally in the swamp. Womp womp. Vlad grew up, and Vlad grew up hard, and the Ottomans, once they threatened to invade his homeland, stepped up to defend Wallachia, and he did it! Hooray! Except it's not really hooray, because then Vlad went mental, and not mental like the Geordie Maca mental, but the worst kind of mental. After beating his feuding rival in one-on-one combat reportedly, he took a look around him and said, "Oh wow, this place is awash with blood and misery, and it definitely can't be my fault for all of these years of war. No, it has to be these warlords' fault." So he came up with the only rational way to solve this situation. He invited them all around to a beautiful banquet full of women and food and copious amounts of stabbing in the back where they were all killed violently. But that wasn't enough for Vlad. No, just to get rid of them wasn't enough. So instead, what he then did after that was he took a big old tree, sharpened it into a big old point, and enacted what was called impaling. Impaling was a form of torture and execution where a giant tree or piece of wood was either sharpened or blunted into a point where it was then inserted into the back end of the unfortunate recipient, and it would go through the bottom and out of the top, oftentimes protruding out of the top of the shoulders, or in the most unfortunate cases, the mouth. The poles were often rounded instead of pointed to avoid puncturing the internal organs, thus prolonging the life of the unfortunate soul on the I was going to say on the other end of the pole, but they're kind of on both ends. Records state that it could take days for people to die who were unfortunately subjugated to this form of torture and execution. And Vlad said, well, that's not enough. Let's put them on display outside of our castle grounds. You know, like a really, really backwards Phoenix window. So putting warlords on display outside of your castle in such a way is probably enough of a message, right? Not if you're Vlad, because then he went down into the neighboring Saxon villages, rounded up a bunch of hostages, and did the same thing to them as a message to his opposition to say, don't fuck with me, I have the power of trees and decoration on my side. Ah! Peace was restored in 1460, and that was the end of that. Except it wasn't, because then an Ottoman Sultan came to Vlad III and said, "You have to pay homage to me personally." And Vlad said, "Oh, I could. Or I could nail your religious headdresses to your head and then stick you on poles outside of my castle. That sounds like a much sweeter deal for me. What say you?" Sorry, you can't reply because you're on a stick outside of my castle. Your envoys that have accompanied you as well? Nails, spike, filthy prank. Historians debate that around 20,000 people fell victim to being impaled under Vlad the Impaler. 1477 rolls around and karma finally gets Vlad. And by karma, I mean a group of very angry Ottomans who probably weren't super happy about all of their friends being displayed like a kebab in the local takeaway. He gets his head cut off and it gets taken to Sultan Mehmed II, who's probably quite happy to see him a little bit smaller than he was when he was doing all of this. Vlad the Impaler's cutthroat nature would directly inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula. So in all of that, surely Vlad the Impaler is the most devious bastard in New York City. Except not at all. Stag, back to you at the news desk. As history marched on, individuals would continue to crop up and make massive bastards of themselves. For our next report, we now go live to our infield reporter, Stag, who's being made to do his report outside because we here in the studio are all in agreement that he smells. Stag. Hello from the middle of nowhere. I don't see how it was relevant to put me out here in the middle of nowhere for this report. Well, I suggest you get on with your story or go and have a wash, Stinky. Which is it? I'll get on with the story. For hundreds of years, the finger could be pointed at world leaders to say that they are history's biggest arseholes. Famously among the few, Joseph Stalin, who is responsible for the deaths of over 20 million of his own people through forced labor, imprisonment, and of course, executions for being considered enemies of the state. Get off my farmland! To put that number into perspective, it's only a few million less than those who fell under the tyranny of the Nazis during World War II. Chinese leader Mao Zedong was responsible for the deaths of millions through famine, persecution, and the Great Leap Forward. There was Pol Pot, Leopold II, Genghis Khan. I already told you once. I'm sorry. And of course, most famously among those, one Adolf Lindsay Ann Hitler. Was that supposed to be a joke? Just a little one to lighten the mood. In a report about world leaders causing the deaths of millions of people, you find it appropriate to make a joke where the one man responsible for history's most disgusting anti-Semitic persecution has a girl's name. Apparently, yes. Stag, do yourself a favor. Stay there until it rains and lay face down. I'm sorry. World leaders the world over have consistently been massive bastards. But what about the everyman? Has history had a problem with street bastards? And if so, for how long for? To answer that question, we go live again to Stag at the news wall. Stag. Thank you, Stag. Well, you could argue that anybody that became an evil bastard in history started out life as an everyman, a friend, a neighbor, the milkman delivery person, or maybe just someone who needed a hand repairing their car. Somebody like Ted Bundy, a man who I'm sure needs no introduction, so we won't dwell on that. What about Terrare, the French soldier who had an appetite for literally everything, going as far as to eat entire cows and also infant babies? Or a clown like John Wayne Gacy, the man responsible for the deaths of 33 young men and boys, who would oftentimes lure these young men to his home with a promise of drink and drugs before showing them a series of tricks, one of which he would call the handcuff trick, where he would handcuff his arms behind his back and release himself before offering to teach the young man how to do it themselves. Once he got the handcuffs on the individual, he would then lean in and say, "The trick is, you have to have the key." Of course, once he had them handcuffed, he could do whatever he wanted to. History is full of killers and scoundrels, information that is so very easily accessible, and information you probably already knew watching this video, let's be honest. But what about the other side of history? The other side of the coin? What? Well, I thought maybe we could finish this video talking about the good in humanity instead of focusing on just the negative.
This is a news segment called History's Biggest Bastard.
No, don't get me wrong, I know that's what we've called it, but what if we're focusing on the wrong thing?
Oh, don't be ridiculous.
No, seriously, I mean, we all know about history's biggest bastards. We see them all the time. We learn about them all the time. But what about the people that have influenced the world for good? People like Alexander Fleming, the guy who accidentally invented penicillin. By all accounts, Alexander Fleming was just a Hmong scientist who didn't clean up after himself and then went on holiday. But he came home to find that mold that had been left to grow in a petri dish had developed a chemical that killed the bacteria surrounding it. This discovery would lead to the creation of the antibiotic penicillin, which would go on to save millions upon millions of lives from infection.
People don't want to hear about the good things in history. They're already clicking off.
What about John Snow in 1854 in London on Broad Street, who discovered after removing the handle from a water pump that cholera was a waterborne disease, forever revolutionizing how we investigate diseases in the world. I made friends with the farmer. He's my best friend now, and he's coming to mine for tea tomorrow.
Nelson Mandela survived 27 years in prison before being released and becoming the president of South Africa, teaching people to not be violent and instead rise above and embrace reconciliation.
Sometimes it falls upon a generation to be great. You can be that great generation. Let your greatness blossom. Of course, the task will not be easy, but not to do this would be a crime against humanity.
Desmond Dawes is a man who fought in World War II without fighting. He was a combat medic that practiced conscientious objection and went on to save countless lives in the hellfire of the Pacific Theater. And then there are the heroes that are closer to home. Mums, dads, friends. You could be somebody's hero.
That's it, I'm pulling the plug. This is getting ridiculous. Thank you so very much for
Maybe
watching.
you're history's biggest bastard, Stag.
Well, factually, that's just not correct.
I don't want you to be in this video anymore.
So no is the answer. The human race has not always been terrible. There are good people out there if you look for them. And whilst there are some bad folks around right now, be one of the good ones. Tell your family that you love them. Hold a door for a stranger, be kind, and we'll see you in the next one. I am off to buy a bath.
You know, while I was researching this video, I was looking at a list that was publicly polled of the 20 biggest villains in history and ranked higher than Saddam Hussein and Pol Pot and Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin was Bill Clinton. You really are the most devious bastard in all of New York City.